Reading. Recognize the Deputy Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We're going to call Bill number 247, Correctional Services Act.
Bill number 247, the Correctional Services Act. Is the House ready for the question? Second reading. Recognize the Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I admire the Honourable Speaker's motion, because I am ready for the question, but just in case other members do have a chance to want to intervene for a few moments. Mr. Speaker, I'll only speak briefly on this bill. This bill, Mr. Speaker, is a bill that was brought in by the government in a sincere desire to modernize the parts of our justice system which, frankly, the professional legislation which is in much need of modernization. In the last session, we dealt with the Police Act, Mr. Speaker, and the reason we dealt with the Police Act is because obviously policing is very important to the justice system in Nova Scotia. Another pillar of our justice system in Nova Scotia is corrections, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, corrections is very important to our justice system, and in particular, the workers, the people who work in that system, are vital to our justice system. And Mr. Speaker, we need a modernized piece of legislation, and this legislation is that piece of legislation. It also deals with a number of new ideas and concepts that are coming up, particularly in the area of conditional sentencing, around the issue of the so-called bracelets that are determined to monitor people who are on conditional sentences or house arrest orders to make sure that those people are complying with those orders. It provides for that. It provides for a clear role of community corrections. Community corrections is the so-called parole or probation officer service, which deals with the people who are there. It provides also, Mr. Speaker, for clear direction around issues such as providing information, vital information, to our probation officers who have to do pre-sentence reports, Mr. Speaker, an important part of our justice system to allow for the proper sentencing of people who have been convicted of criminal offenses in our society. So, Mr. Speaker, there has been one wide consultation with the affected employees through their union. There has been consultation over a long period of time within the department and without. And, Mr. Speaker, I would ask that the bill be approved in principle, which is what second reading is about, and sent to Law Amendments Committee. And I would therefore move second reading, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. I'll recognize the Honourable Member for Cape Breton Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, Mr. Speaker, I think I'm going to say probably a few words about this, but, and again, I think to assure the Minister that we will be moving this on to law amendments and I think have it properly vetted. But, it's interesting because one of the aspects the Minister has brought up and kind of put it as one of the tenets of this bill is the conditions that the workers have to work under. And that's an interesting one because, in last spring's setting of this House, I stood here in my place and discussed with this Minister and asked this Minister questions on how certain workers in the justice system were being denied their justice, that they were being denied the ability to have an arbitration done in an expedited time, in an amount of time that was more orderly, if you will, Mr. Speaker, because what we end up happening was the Department of Justice withheld the proper time limits and so on this arbitration to the detriment of the worker. The worker ended up winning the arbitration. But Mr. Speaker, it was much like, winning the battle but losing the war. While this worker was waiting to have his fair hearing, one in which he won, as I say, he went into bankruptcy, Mr. Speaker. He went into other debts, Mr. Speaker. He tried other jobs and so on. But the department fought him at every step of the way, even to the point when he went to get EI, that they showed up at the EI hearing with the referees to argue against this worker getting his EI benefits. That was the type of draconian methods that this department used against a worker. And now the minister is saying, well, that's all behind us now. That, we've got the dignity of the workers tantamount in our mind, and we're going to help protect them. Well, Mr. Speaker, these are these people that work in custodial positions in our provincial jails. It's not, and I shouldn't have to tell this House, not an easy job. Mr. Speaker, more and more these people that are showing up in our provincial jails are violent criminals, are convicted criminals that have a history and a real problem. And yet, it took us this far or this long to come up with this bill, but yet, I've got to wonder when the minister says that he sees in this bill real protection for the guards in this bill. It doesn't jump out at me the type of protection that these workers need, Mr. Speaker. Another aspect of our provincial institutions, Mr. Speaker, is the overall general safety of them, and I mean that in the perspective of the communities in which they're placed. I have one in my community in Gardner Mines. And just this past weekend, Mr. Speaker, there was a break there, and as not hearing a news bulletin in the last short while, I believe the 2 inmates are still at large. And to the point that the media were advised, obviously by people in the correctional services, that these people were dangerous. But Mr. Speaker, I realize that this is, it's almost stating the obvious, but in reality, someone could be in there for forgery or something like that. That's not really seen as something that's could cause grievous bodily harm to anybody. But on the other side, these, I think both of these gentlemen were in there under weapons offenses. Now, the idea of what shocks me about this is, and I hope this will be coming out in the investigation, internal investigation, of how this happened. Because from what I've been told by people that have been working around there, that there was workers in there outside of the correctional institution doing some upgrades in and around, and there was tools being left around and so on. And let's find out for sure that these weren't used in aiding and abetting these felons to get out on the street, Mr. Speaker. That would cause me great concern because, there's within walking distance of that facility, there's at least 15 or 20 residential houses, Mr. Speaker, which these people need to be afforded the greatest amount of security. And so these are issues. And the area I believe that they did escape from was an area about some 9-10 years ago, which was the same kind of recreational yard that was where 4 people were waiting trial. All 4 serious offenders that have since been on and convicted and gone on to do federal time. In that area, the escape was gained by taking a bar off the weights they were using and just used the bar to pry the fence up, and these folks slid under it, Mr. Speaker. And let's hope that that same situation was not used, that indeed that the workers, that had been rectified and they were duped by that same method once again. So, Mr. Speaker, there's 2 vital aspects when we talk about correctional services, in as much as we talk about safety. One is the obviously why those criminals are in these institutions in the first place, to be taken out of the general population of our society, and that our society be protected by it. So therefore, we have to make sure that once they're in there for their term or until such time as they fulfilled the major part of their sentence, Mr. Speaker, and are deemed to be able to go on the street again. But on the other one, Mr. Speaker, is really the fact about how well protected are the workers. Now, the minister says that's one of the major embodiments in this bill. That's one of the major embodiments in this bill. And you know, Mr. Speaker, I know in those places, for instance, for the safety of those workers, they don't have like regular ties like this. I think they have clip ties, right? Isn't that, I think, the way it goes? So if they got in a hassle, the high ties. So that's an important part of safety, about what kind of tie you wear. No, it's not, Mr. Speaker. So that's a very safety conscious effort. But Mr. Speaker, I digress a bit. I want to say, though, that we will be, as I said earlier, we will be supporting this bill to get to law amendments. But I would hope that, that if when we get there and we hear from the workers, and the workers say that these are the other perils we find in our workplace, and we need these to be corrected, and we need our government to stand by us, that the government will say, look, these are good ideas, these are people that do this job, and they know it, and what we'll do is we'll protect them, we'll understand if there's problems on in the workplace, that what we'll do, we respect our employees so much, we'll expedite their arbitrations, and we'll be able to work with them in partnership to lead to a better workplace. So, Mr. Speaker, with those few words, I'll take my place and be glad to see this bill over in law amendments. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll recognize the member for Richmond.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's a pleasure to rise and speak a few words on Bill 47 as Justice Critic for the Liberal Caucus. And first, Speaker, let me say that we're certainly pleased to see that the government is moving to modernize in legislation parts of the justice system, because I think all Nova Scotians will know now that our correctional system certainly has been modernizing significantly over the last few years. So it's important that the legislation catch up to that modernization and properly start to reflect that. Mr. Speaker, one of the main aspects of this bill, which certainly has caught the public's attention and the media's attention, has been the whole concept of applying ankle bracelets to individuals who are serving conditional sentences. Now, Mr. Speaker, I believe our caucus over the last couple of years has certainly been very vocal over the concerns of conditional sentences and whether the government was properly putting in place the necessary framework to make sure that those conditional sentences were actually being met. And I can tell you, Mr. Speaker, outside of this, the efforts with the ankle bracelets, we're still very concerned that, considering that there are hundreds of conditional sentences granted every year in Nova Scotia, meaning that there are hundreds of Nova Scotians serving these conditional sentences, this government continues to turn a blind eye to make sure that these conditional sentences are properly being adhered to, which again, Mr. Speaker, fits into the whole concept of this government's approach on justice, where it continues to talk tough, continues to talk about safety in our communities, safety in our province, yet the reality shows, Mr. Speaker, that for the most part, this government is more than happy to turn a blind eye to some of the serious issues. Now, Mr. Speaker, let us keep in mind, again, without having the specific statistics in front of me, I know I've raised them here in the House previously, that was provided by Statistics Canada, but if we've got hundreds of Nova Scotians serving conditional sentences, the pilot project, which is being suggested by the Minister of Justice, would monitor next year, not this year, but next year, 20 to 30 offenders. What do we do with the rest, the hundreds that are out there serving conditional sentences? Who is watching them? We now know that we can keep a close eye or a close surveillance on 20 to 30. What about the rest? And I thought it was interesting in reading some of the media articles that did come out as a result of this announcement, and I noted the comments being made in the Cape Breton Post by Chief Edgar McLeod, the chief of the Cape Breton Regional Municipality, which is the second largest police force here in this province. And he said he wished there was no pilot project, that he'd like to see the ankle bracelets being used now rather than a pilot project. In fact, he'd like to see them on probably every offender. But one of the interesting things that he brought up, which again comes back to the concern we have raised, is he makes reference to a program which used to exist in our justice system. Mr. Speaker, if I'm not mistaken, that program used to be called Program Alert, if I'm not mistaken, but I could be wrong on that. But I note with interest the article in the Cape Breton Post dated Friday, October 21st, where it says, when conditional sentences were first being applied in the province, justice officials piloted another program here in Cape Breton in which police and probation officers visited the offender's home at random times. The program was deemed a success, but was abruptly cancelled nearly 2 years ago, which left offenders unsupervised, with probation officers, police, friends, family, and neighbors left to report violations of conditions. Now, Mr. Speaker, it is this government, this minister, that cancelled that pilot project that Chief Edgar MacLeod has deemed a tremendous success. To date, we have not been given an adequate reason as to why the program has been cancelled, other than to infer that it was due to costs that the government cut this program. So again, an example of where the government talks tough on crime and on safety, and yet their actions seem to point to the exact opposite. Mr. Speaker, this bill refers to our justice system, more specifically our correction system, but it's again an opportunity to remind the government that we continue to have serious issues about safety in our communities here in Nova Scotia. We continue to have too many of our youth using illegal drugs. We continue to have too many of our youth being involved in crime. We continue to hear stories of swarmings, shootings, all things that are not part of the Nova Scotia culture. It is not what we consider to be acceptable here in this province. These are all matters that the government has turned a blind eye to, and to this day continues to talk tough when it comes to safety, when it comes to justice, but their actions seem to say the exact opposite. I find it interesting that the Minister of Justice and his colleagues, in one sense, say they don't like conditional sentences. They wish more people were sent to jail. That's quite a bold statement. Probably gets the attention of Nova Scotians, but the reality is, this is the same government that closed almost every rural jail there was in this province. They closed them all, other than the number of regional institutions. So, put more of our young offenders in jail, put more Nova Scotians who commit crimes in jail, but while you're not looking, we're going to close the jails. So there's nowhere to put them. That is, again, a sign of the hypocrisy that has come from this justice minister and has come from this government. Because their get tough on crime is a speech and it's puffery and nothing more. And the results speak for themselves when we read each day in the paper, or each week in the paper, of serious crimes continuing to be committed here in this province, and the fact that Nova Scotians are not taking this government seriously when it comes to justice issues here in this province. Mr. Speaker, having had the opportunity as a member of the legal profession to work with some of the members who work in the correctional services, I can tell you we have very fine men and women who dedicate their days to working in our correctional service. And it's important that we put in place the necessary safeguards to make sure that their work is a safe environment and that they are properly protected under what can be some of the difficult circumstances. And I can tell you, Mr. Speaker, from my own experience, one of the positive steps that the government has taken, without being too negative to the government, is the construction of a new justice facility for the Strait area. Mr. Speaker, we now have a facility that is properly constructed, that can handle offenders in a safe manner, that protects not only the justice officials, but it certainly protects the correctional officials as well. I remember attending a number of court hearings at the old Justice Centre in Port Hawkesbury, which basically was in the basement of the old residences for the vocational school. And I remember going in there, Mr. Speaker, and this being a basement, certainly it wasn't the most pleasant place to start off with, but offenders who hadn't been charged with violent crimes were being brought in shackles, both on their wrists and on their ankles. And I remember asking one of the correctional services employees there, why would you have this individual who's on here for more of a petty crime in these shackles? And he said, because of the facility we have here, which is so poorly constructed and poorly laid out, we really have no means of catching an offender if he decides to run. That was some of the problems that existed in the system. And again, Mr. Speaker, as I said, the construction of the new justice facility has certainly gone a long ways into addressing that problem in the Strait area, and hopefully that is also being done in areas throughout the rest of the province. Mr. Speaker, I do hope that this bill will make its way to law amendments, and look forward to hearing from those that are involved, both in the legal profession and with the correctional services, about any of the changes that we might be able to implement here. But let us not for 1 minute be fooled into believing that putting 20 to 30 ankle bracelets on offenders who are serving conditional sentences in this province, of which I have already told you there are hundreds per year, is going to provide added security to Nova Scotians. It is one small step, but this should not be the last step that this government should take. Bring back the program that allowed police officers to accompany probation officers to do random checks on offenders in this province. That way, and with other steps, which I'm sure others will suggest, will bring more safety to our communities and give Nova Scotians a strong sense that if you are convicted of an offense and you are given a conditional sentence, that that sentence will be carried out and that you will properly serve the conditions of that sentence, and more importantly, that Nova Scotians, wherever they live in this province, can feel safe in knowing that our justice system is working properly and that this government's statements about protecting our communities is not mere puffery, but we can work towards making it a reality. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Can recognize the honourable member for Timberley Prospect.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This particular piece of legislation, Bill 247, an act respecting the provision of correctional services, is of great interest to me, Mr. Speaker, because as many in this House are aware, that having grown up in a community just the other side of the New Brunswick border, and having had a father who worked for 25 long years in the correctional services in various federal penitentiaries, I can tell you this is a piece of legislation that I took some great interest in. And I'm going to make some comments along that line. I should also remind the Minister of Education opposite that aside from our Frontier College experience, where we both began that love of teaching, my first real for-pay job while my father was working in a different institution was that I served a period of time, and I have to be careful how I say that because they let me out on the weekends. I served as a teacher at Dorchester Penitentiary. This correctional officer son is proud to say that there are some inclusions in this modernized piece of legislation that my father would support. However, the one thing that's of real importance to all of us as legislators is we realize when it comes to a piece of legislation like this, perhaps we have more questions than answers at this stage of the bill. And as the bill proceeds and we go to law amendments, hopefully we'll have the opportunity to hear from some correctional officers, from probation officers, because these are the very people, and they have been consulted. The minister has brought that to our attention, and that's of some importance, that the experts have been consulted when it comes to making sure that the justice system in this province, and of course we're dealing about provincial jails, 2 years less a day, and various other important orders that are brought forward from our courts, protect Nova Scotians each and every day. But Mr. Speaker, we are no longer facing a justice system where we lock them up and throw away the key. Because I want you to know, Mr. Speaker, based upon my personal experience, the recidivativeness, a very important word, the recidivativeness rate of young offenders who, and they're above the age, of course, of 20 in most cases, who make a history of crime, returning time after time after time, as they begin to realize that when they are in a institution, whether it's the minimum institutions in places such as Spring Hill, the federal institution in Dorchester, or heaven forbid they end up in the Renous facility on the North Shore of New Brunswick, or in provincial jails across this province and in this region. In many cases, these facilities are schools for crime, because what happens is that the young man or young woman is put in a situation where they are in jail, and in many cases, Mr. Speaker, they have really nothing else to do but talk about when they get out what they're going to do. And if that role model and that positive reinforcement is not there, the result, of course, is that they will return to crime. And they will return to, in some cases, an even more violent type of crime. And I heard my colleague from Cape Breton Centre make reference to the situation that has happened in his constituency and the facility at Gardner Mines that has had 2 escapees that are at large. And let me tell you, and I want members opposite to know, that I can recall those nights that when the sirens would go and the lights would come on at the hill in Dorchester, and we would realize that somebody from the farm camp, as it was called, Mr. Speaker, had run. Because let's be clear on something. If no members here have never had the opportunity to visit Dorchester, it would be an important place to go. Because let me tell you, you don't go over those walls. When there's an escapee from a federal institution in the New Brunswick Atlantic region, it's usually from a farm camp, the Westmoreland facility, or some other kind of, what shall we call, I suppose, minimum facility when it comes to the penal system, whether it's federally or provincially. And when that siren goes and you realize there's someone at large, you know, when we live on Guard Row, which is, if you've traveled, of course, on the CN line between Halifax and Montreal, when you come across the marsh, you look in the distance and you see this, as the students that I've taken to Montreal many times before, what's that castle over there on the hill? Well, let me tell you, Mr. Speaker, that's no castle. That is, after all, an old 1887 built federal penitentiary. And we have to make sure that the people, whether it's in federal penitentiaries or under the jurisdiction of this particular minister, provincial jails, are safe places for correctional officers to work, are safe places where they can feel that they are always, of course, have to be on guard for their own health, on guard for their own safety, on guard for the inmates who are under their care. But they have to feel that they are being listened to when it comes to legislation such as this particular piece of legislation. And I want you to know, Mr. Speaker, that on many occasions I've heard my father say, no one seems to want to consult us when it comes to a difficulty, when it comes to an inmate that they have to deal with that has some particular issues. Now, having worked in a federal penitentiary and having been in the past on occasion as a visitor, I highlight that fact, in a provincial jail, because at one time as the vice principal at Sackville High School, we did have a couple of students who had day passes to go to our school. Now, I know the member from Hants East is looking at me thinking like, now that must have been an interesting challenge. These young men were put in a situation where they could improve themselves, and I must assure you, Mr. Speaker, that half of those projects, one of the 2 young men, worked out quite well, and he did find his way back to get a proper education and is now employed in one of the communities that I represent. But, Mr. Speaker, I want you to know that when you're in one of those situations, in a jail situation, there is a lot at risk. A lot at risk is around you. You never, ever take a break. You never, ever let down your guard. Because in those sort of situations, there are people who are very volatile, people who have many more issues than just the crime that they have dealt with. And so I want to share, if I may, one of the saddest events as a school teacher that I dealt with in that particular institution where I worked. And I know that when we hear from correctional officers, they'll say they've had to deal with that issue. Now, as a young know-it-all, I know the Minister of Education would join me on this, a young know-it-all teacher at the time, teaching upgrading to inmates. This one particular day, one of my students, of course, was older than me, and I must now, when it comes to the skills of life, knew much more about it than I did, was having a particularly tough day. But I was concerned about the fact that he didn't have this particular assignment done. And it was an assignment, I can remember the specifics of it. How would Sir John A. Macdonald be treated today with the modern media? Interesting topic. It was one that I had assigned. It was one that this man was quite interested in, because that particular man, I'm not sure where he is now, but that particular man shared his problems because he, of course, was a member of AA, and it was something of real interest. That particular day, that particular student and inmate did not participate in the discussion. So finally, of course, overstepping the bounds, I turned to him and I said, I'm sort of disappointed, calling him by his first name. What's the problem? You don't want to take part in this discussion? Well, it was one of those situations where it's not a typical classroom. And that man told me what I could do with a discussion with Sir John A. Macdonald. And he told me in very clear, simple language. Now, of course, the guards are also in the classroom making sure that there are no incidents because, of course, you know, as someone who's working in that particular situation. Afterwards, he came to apologize to me for using that language in our class. But he told me he just received a phone call that his mother had died. And that because of his sentence, he would not be released to go at that time to her funeral. His particular crime was a particularly heinous one, if I can use that word. It was a violent crime, and he was doing hard time for a long time in that institution. So when you look at those particular incidents, you say to yourself, you know, the people who are dealing with inmates day in, day out, they're dealing with incidents outside of the walls or outside of the jail. They're dealing with really very, very volatile individuals. And so I hear the minister, and I am appreciative of the fact that this piece of legislation has some changes in it that are of some consequence. But I want, and I know that our particular critic when it comes to justice will have some comments on this, I want to draw attention to particularly the provisions in here dealing with female offenders. Because in certain situations, and I want you to know I have never been in one of the federal institutions or provincial institutions for women, but there has to be a provision clearly stated that a female inmate would be guarded and taken care of by a female correctional officer. That's that important to make sure that that provision is included. And it is. It's a very worthwhile example of how we must deal with the realities of what it's like behind the bars or behind the fences in whatever particular job we have within the institution. And of course, there are these terms that are thrown around with great abandon. And some of them really are quite controversial, and each of them in their way could be debated. We look at some of these terms: conditional releases, electronic monitoring, open custody, house arrest. You know, Mr. Speaker, over the last couple of days, I've received calls from people in my constituency concerned about a house arrest. And a particular community that I am fortunate enough to represent, a call about rumors about somebody who is under house arrest on a certain street in a certain community that I represent. Those terms have to be very much clearly defined, particularly when we look at the issue of open custody. Now, I see those terms, and I'm looking forward to hearing from the Minister of Justice. I'm looking forward to hearing from other members of this House when it comes to the term open custody. Then, of course, there's the issue of electronic monitoring. And, of course, there is much ballyhoo about the fact that we are going to have, in this province, people released from our provincial jails who will have bracelets. And these particular electronic devices will be able to monitor where these lawbreakers, let's call them where they are located within our communities. Or is that the beat-all and the end-all answer? It's a step. It's a modern step. I think that if the proper conditions are looked at, and it is something that is well researched by the experts behind the walls, behind the fences, and if those people recommend, based upon their professional expertise, if they recommend a conditional release with this particular factor of these electronic devices, then that's one that I certainly will support. Because after all, these are the men, these are the women, these are the experts, and they should be listened to. And I congratulate the Minister and the Department for consulting these particular experts, who of course are the ones who really understand the pressure and stress in the jobs in which they are doing. But I want to draw attention to the fact that there's another side to this, and that side, of course, is to the protection of the public. The protection of the public when it comes to the fact that when you place a call to the local RCMP station, in my case, or it could be perhaps the local police station in a town or another jurisdiction across this province. And as a provincial official, you're inquiring about the fact that at civic number such and such on street so and so, you're hearing rumors that there is somebody living at that home that is on a conditional release, that is electronically monitored, if that's the proper term now, or perhaps under house arrest. I'm fully supportive of private factors and the issue of privacy. But I want you to know, Mr. Speaker, it remains a concern for many Nova Scotians that we have to be fully aware of if we have within our communities these particular inmates, although they're not inmates once they walk out the door, these particular individuals who have these electronic monitoring devices and where they are located in our towns and in our communities. How close are they to schools? What particularly, for what length of time are they going to be connected to these electronic monitoring devices? All issues that I know will come forward at law amendments, all issues that I know we'll speak about in greater detail. The concerns, of course, and the answers will be the connection. That connection is, after all, what will have the trust of Nova Scotians when it comes to what they think of this piece of legislation. It's important to go beyond that headline. That headline when it comes down to the electronic monitoring, when we're looking at the bracelet suggestion, we have to look at the many other things that are included in this piece of legislation. It is, as the minister said, an improvement. It is an important step. It is a modernization of an important piece of legislation. But I think it's also important to realize that there are some changes which perhaps we should carefully monitor. We should look at the long-term implications of these. And when it comes to law amendments and we have the opportunity to hear from correctional officers, when we hear from their union, or when we hear from probation officers, that will be the opportunity for us as legislatures to learn even more about the situation that these men and women are doing for the service that they are doing for our province. So, Mr. Speaker, with those comments, I will take my place. I look forward to this piece of legislation moving on to law amendments. I look forward to the opportunity to hearing from correctional officers and other individuals in the justice system as we continue with this piece of legislation. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. I'll recognize the honourable member for Hants East.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'm not really pleased to stand and speak on Bill 247, an act respecting the provisions of correctional services. And the reason for that is that I've been dealing with an issue for one of my constituents who is a correctional worker and an officer. Now, so the part that has drawn my attention of this bill, Mr. Speaker, is Part 3, General, and Clause 94.1, the Minister may, with the approval of Governor Council, make regulations. And if you look down those regulations, A, B, C, D, E, E says, respecting the duties, assignments, privileges, and benefits of employees not covered by a collective agreement. Well, Mr. Speaker, my constituent, and I've raised this with the Minister in budget estimates, so it's on the public record, and I've spoke to my constituent on this issue, and he says, yeah, by all means, use my name and speak on my behalf. As a gentleman named Mike Trask, who lives in Mount Uniacke in my constituency. And Mike has a disability. He is dyslexic, and actually all he really was trying to do was seek accommodation for his disability, and which for him would have been some level of privacy or access to a computer in a way that there is some level of privacy, and this has not been able to be done. And I want to say that Mike first walked in my office or phoned me, I forget which, but in 2003, and so it's been 2 years that he's been waging this battle. and 2 years that I've been involved. And actually, he's been waging it since before that, and probably since 2002, actually, when he raised the issue with management to help accommodate him for his disability. Now, there was supposed to be a plan identified in 2002, but that plan was never implemented, and really no accommodation has ever been made for Mike. And so it seems to be one roadblock after another. It seems that at the, I don't know what, all the levels of bosses that Mike might have, but they've done far better. They've been promoted, and presently, I mean, he's been through mediation, and presently he's on long-term disability because of the stress that he's been put through. He has great support from his doctors, and they, I have to say, cannot believe in the 21st century that someone with a disability would be treated the way that this gentleman has been treated. And it's my understanding that employees in correctional services are you know, given a rough time. He's not the first one that I've talked to. He's just the first one that I've spent a fair bit of time, and I guess because the others took other routes to seek help and weren't my constituents. But he is not alone. There is a history of giving employees a pretty rough time in correctional services. I asked the Minister of Justice for a meeting and got it. I found the minister gave us what I thought was an open ear, and I was really pleased. Actually, I've asked the minister, I think, 3 different times for meetings on 3 different issues with constituents, and the minister was more than accommodating. He gave us some of his time. I know my constituents really appreciated that fact, but the bottom line for Mike is that nothing was ever done, and I've raised it with the minister, like I said, in budget estimates, and I've written the Premier on it, and I'm waiting for a response in that regard. But I want to say that I am amazed. My background is teaching. The Minister of Education would know certainly about how school boards try to deal with students who have disabilities. We try to accommodate in the education system. We try to overcome barriers for these people. We try to make them productive citizens in our society. It's one of those cases where an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. You know, that's the sooner that you can intervene and help these students, the better off, the better chance you have in preventing some of the damage of their disability. There are a lot of people, particularly from years ago when there wasn't really so much understood about a number of learning disabilities. There wasn't a lot known about how to accommodate, and actually students spent more time trying to hide. They would come up with strategies of trying to work and to try to achieve and mask their disability, even though they weren't even sure they had one. But they were trying to meet their goals. And the Minister of Education would definitely be aware of how the area of education has tried to really be forward-thinking and helping with students with disabilities. Well, there are people who have come through the system before we knew anything about a number of these learning disabilities, and so they've tried in their own way to meet the test, to be employed, and to do the job. And yet, here we are in the 21st century with a gentleman who has had his disability diagnosed. He knows his limitations. We have the technology that could help him with his limitation, and I can't believe that whether it's a computer or access in a specific way so he can get his reports done and so on, that this is a big problem for this government. I cannot believe that for what that would cost, that they're digging their heels in on this, and they are. The Department of Justice is digging its heels in when it comes to helping this man. And, you know, for him to be forced into long-term disability because of the level of stress that he's put under is amazing. This is a man who's had a lot of uphill battles, but has faced them all and won them all, and actually got himself to a point where he got trained and was able to be hired by correctional services, and that is a remarkable thing. And actually, I think he's had the help of former ministers in this regard. I think he's had the help of a present minister. The Minister for Community Services, I think, was one that had helped him. I think that the Honourable George Archibald, I think, when he was a minister, he had written letters and tried to help Mr. Trask. So you know, I mean, there are members on the other side of the House who have tried to help Mr. Trask, but somewhere along the line, that help has dried right up, and I cannot, for the life of me, figure out why. And for me to think that in this day and age, if we would help some student through the education system with their disability and put them in the workforce and then abandon them, that would make no sense to me whatsoever. But there is some archaic view around this disability in the Department of Justice, and I can't fathom what it is. But this gentleman, by all accounts, is a good employee, a hard worker, really likes what he does, and he is going to be, as far as I can see, the mood here is to drive him out. I can't read it any other way. So, Mr. Speaker, in this piece of legislation, the government has even indicated their employees. Matter of fact, the minister even spoke here today when he introduced or brought this bill for second reading. He even indicated the value of the employees in the system. But yet, I haven't seen anywhere in the battle that this gentleman has gone through that the minister believes that. And if he does, he can act pretty darn quickly to rectify any problems that this man has had as an employee and trying to be accommodated for a disability. And I certainly hope that the minister is listening to this message. And I know that, and my impression is that certainly some of his staff definitely are not helpful either. So, Mr. Speaker, with those comments, I take my seat and hope that if there's anybody who is listening, that they can try to help Mr. Trask in his plight. Thanks, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Recognize the honourable member for Cole Harbour Eastern Passage.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I wanted to take some time to talk with regard to this bill before us. Mr. Speaker, this is an issue, and let me be clear, I mean, we'll be voting for this bill at second reading because as a principle, modernizing our correction services is a good idea. There are some specific issues that I do want to bring forward, though, with regard to the principle that is being promoted in this legislation, and generally speaking with regard to corrections in Nova Scotia. I want to start with, and I know that the labor standards aspects of corrections is not part of this bill, that's my understanding, but Mr. Speaker, there are issues that have, as a justice critic for my party, excuse me, for the last number of years, I've heard regularly from prison corrections officers working in our adult prisons, and they have a lot of concerns with how this department has been run. They have a lot of concerns with what this division has been doing. And I won't say it goes to the top level, because I think there's generally a lot of respect for the Executive Director of Corrections in Nova Scotia. It's more about the people operating the actual prisons, operating maybe even particularly the person who used to operate the central Central Regional Correction Facility, Mr. Speaker. There's a lot of concern amongst the staff as to safety issues with regard to health and safety issues, Mr. Speaker, and these are issues that need attention from this government, ones that I've raised in this House in the past, ones I've raised with the minister privately, and ones that to this day I don't understand why they have not addressed them. A good example of that is with regard to arbitrations. These workers in some cases are left, have been removed from their job, they've been dismissed, and they're waiting more than a year to be able to have a hearing and get a decision to know whether they can be reinstated in their job or whether they have to go out and find other work, Mr. Speaker. And in many cases, it can be argued that those dismissals are arguable, and yet instead of trying to expedite the process, instead of trying to ensure that we're appointing arbitrators as quickly as possible, whether it's a tribunal or a single one, this government has dragged its feet, Mr. Speaker, and as a result, there are people out there that have had a lot of hardship, who are good, hard-working members of the correction services, have had a lot of hardship because of it, Mr. Speaker, and yet this government does nothing. I want to talk about the fact that I know that having spoken to advocate groups, particularly Elizabeth Fry Society of mainland Nova Scotia, they've brought up the issue, Mr. Speaker, of how the policies with regard to how correction services operates need to be not only modernized but publicized. This government likes to talk about being open and accountable, Mr. Speaker, yet the policies by which they make decisions for disciplining inmates, and in the case of Elizabeth Fry, specifically female inmates, but let's say it to all inmates, Mr. Speaker, results in the fact that we don't have clear policies that are published so that the people who are either in prison, their loved ones who may be advocating on their behalf, or specific groups that advocate on behalf of prisoners, Mr. Speaker, do not know exactly what the rules are. And frankly, that's not appropriate. Whatever you may say about those that are inmates that are spending time in jail, whatever you may say, whatever your opinion, and I know the spectrum ranges as to why these people may be in jail, the fact is that if they're there, there's still a duty to treat them fairly, to treat them with some humanity, Mr. Speaker, and yet without those policies being in the hands of the people that advocate on their behalf, without the actual inmates being able to see what the policies are with regard to how they're disciplined and what the appeal process is, they really do not have the right to due process, Mr. Speaker. That is wrong. That is not appropriate, and it's something I'd like to see addressed in this legislation as well. I know that there's talk of putting them on the website for the government so that people can access them. But doing that on a voluntary basis, Mr. Speaker, you know as well as I do, does not guarantee they're going to stay there. The next Minister of Justice, the next Executive Director of Correction Services, the next Premier may decide that they want to do things differently and that they may use them as an example and try and remove the, the access to these documents. By law, that must be in this legislation. By law, those who work with inmates, those who advocate on behalf of those that help them to ensure that they have due process in the disciplinary process need to have access to those documents. That, I understand, is not in this legislation at the moment. That is not the law of this province, and frankly, that is wrong and something that I would like to see changed, Mr. Speaker. I think it's also important, Mr. Speaker, to talk about corrections generally. This is a bill that talks about moving people into house arrest. The Minister of Justice will say house arrest is a fact of life. We don't control that. He's right. It's the Federal Department of Justice that controls the criminal code and the use of house arrest. He's right. We do not have the ability to dictate where and when house arrest is used. It's in the legislation of the Criminal Code of Canada, and it's up to the judges, provincial court judges, Supreme Court judges in Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker, to decide how they are going to where and when they will use house arrest based on the statute, the Criminal Code of Canada. But, Mr. Speaker, there are things that this Minister of Justice can do. Time and time again, he stands in this House and likes to call himself a leader with regard to criminal community safety, crime prevention, and correction services, Mr. Speaker. Yet, when the time comes to actually do something that can make a difference, he refuses to act. He blames the police at the municipal level. He blames the federal government for their actions in the Criminal Code of Canada, yet refuses to do things that can make things better. Mr. Speaker, you know as well as I do that only recently we have introduced legislation that will get tough with regard to drug havens, chop shops, body houses, places that are centers of criminal activity in our communities. It took the NDP to step forward to say that is leadership on this issue, Mr. Speaker. Now, Mr. Speaker, I don't want to talk about another bill while I'm talking on this one, But my point is that time and time again, this Minister of Justice will stand in this House and try and convince Nova Scotian that he is actually tough on crime. Well, Mr. Speaker, I've said it before and I'll say it again, that every time I see legislation like this, I see where he is being soft on crime. And I know there's at least one reporter that likes to say that's being disingenuous. I will tell you it is not. Because frankly, this minister, when given the opportunity to remedy loopholes, to fix problems that can make our community safer, to ensure that people who are out on house arrest are actually going to be not violent criminals, he refuses to act. And here's another example of that. This is a bill before us that's going to make, we're going to get 10 bracelets, GPS bracelets. That's going to make people feel safer in their communities when people are out on house arrest. I will tell you what that will do, Mr. Speaker. We are sending a message to the judges and justices in this province that house arrest is now a more secure form of release, and we're going to start seeing more people out on house arrest, Mr. Speaker. We're going to see people being released that I would suspect are more likely to be involved in violent crime. In his own speech, when he tried to introduce this, just before introducing the bill, Mr. Speaker, the minister, in the wording, I tabled the speech. He may not mention it in his verbal speech, but in the written version that we were provided in advance, the two examples he gave were people involved in domestic violence who should stay away from their ex-wives. Mr. Speaker, well, that's domestic violence. That's harassment. That's stalking. And yet we think that's okay to release them on house arrest, when these people clearly have a history of being violent. He talked about keeping people away from playgrounds. Who do we want to keep away from a playground, Mr. Speaker? Who would be on house arrest that should be staying away from playgrounds? Well, as far as I'm concerned, that's molesters and pedophiles. And yet this minister talks about having them out on house arrest. As far as I'm concerned, he's sending a message to the judiciary in this province that it's okay to have these people released. Mr. Speaker, that now it's going to be more secure. House arrest is a better form of protection for the public, and now we can open it up to allow others to be released that maybe in the past the judiciary was a little nervous about doing. What this minister needs to be doing consistently, is giving guidelines to the Director of Public Prosecution, to the Public Prosecution Service, to the Crown Attorneys in this province, and telling them, anytime you have a violent criminal, you must ask for jail. We don't need house arrest with regard, particularly when we're talking sexual offenses, domestic violence offenses, Mr. Speaker. We cannot be talking about this in a way that's going to allow more people who have a tendency towards violence, whether it be within their own domestic situation, whether it be sexual violence. We can't be allowing them out on house arrest. We've seen examples of this in the recent past. And yet this minister, in his own speech that he wants us to have in advance, talks about these as examples of people who could be on house arrest, and how these 10 bracelets are going to make the community safer. It's not going to happen, Mr. Speaker. And frankly, what we need to be seeing is a minister who's willing to recognize that we need to be tougher with them in the sentencing process and with regard to whether or not they're incarcerated. Violent criminals, Mr. Speaker, should not be allowed on our streets, should not be allowed out in a way that they are going to be a threat to our community. And 10 GPS bracelets are not going to make our community safer. They're not going to make it easier for people to feel comfortable in their homes when they know that down the street or around the corner there's someone on house arrest who's committed a violent crime, either against a loved one, against a child, or against someone else, Mr. Speaker. Those are the crimes that we do not want to see people getting house arrest for. And this minister, instead of trying to make it easier, either directly by creating these 10 GPS bracelets, or indirectly by sending a message to the judiciary that it's okay to do house arrest, Mr. Speaker, those are the type of issues that this minister likes to say is leadership. I would argue it's the opposite. It's sending the wrong signal to criminals. It's sending the wrong signal to our judiciary. What we need is a minister and legislation that recognizes the need to ensure that people who have violent background, people who've been convicted of a violent crime, are not released into the community, Mr. Speaker. We shouldn't make it easier, and we shouldn't give false hope that some form of a GPS bracelet is going to make things easier for them. It's going to make life better, more comfortable for the people in the communities. I think, generally speaking, there's a real sense in Canada and in Nova Scotia that house arrest is abused. It's abused by the judiciary, Mr. Speaker, who use it as a way of releasing people who are on the bump between going to jail or not. Mr. Speaker, it could even possibly be used as a way to ensure that we're not incarcerating people and having to pay for the cost of incarcerating them. I agree full well that there are certain types of people committing crimes that don't need to be incarcerated. One's the nonviolent crimes, Mr. Speaker. But when we're talking about violent crimes, we need to assume that some form of incarceration is appropriate, and then look at the situation to see whether there's an exception to that rule. But saying that we're going to make house arrest more acceptable, saying we're going to have a pilot project with 10 GPS bracelets, is sending the wrong signal, and frankly, is misleading the people of Nova Scotia into believing that this is a piece of legislation that's going to make their community safer, Mr. Speaker. Those are my problems with this Correction Act. It's the principles by which this government seems to lead itself. It's the desire to talk about doing something about justice issues, and yet in the end, really doing nothing. That's what this Minister of Justice has done since he was the Minister of Justice in 1999, I believe, except for 4 months back in 2003 when he was the Transportation Minister. This has been the Minister of Justice going on 7 years. 7 years. And our community safer? I think if you walked out this door today and asked the people of Nova Scotia, do you feel safer in your community now than you did in 1999? I think we all know what the answer would be. And it wouldn't be yes. They'd be saying, no, we don't feel as safe. We see vandalism increasing, we see violence increasing, we see use of guns increasing, and this government is doing nothing. In fact, with this type of legislation and ideas like 10 GPS bracelets, Mr. Speaker, this government is actually sending the opposite signal to criminals, to the judiciary, and to the people of Nova Scotia. Let it be clear. They are not serious about solving crime in our province. They're not serious about addressing issues, making sure that criminals who are violent are addressed appropriately. Mr. Speaker, just the opposite. They're looking at this on the other side. And frankly, every time this minister wants to stand up and say, I'm a leader with regard to community safety and crime prevention, every time he wants to say he's being tough on crime, our party's going to be here standing up, calling him on that, and pointing out the fact that's exactly what he isn't. Thank you.
Recognize the honourable member for Cape Breton Nova.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it's been a good debate today on Bill 247, Mr. Speaker, and I listened to my colleagues across the floor and my colleagues here talk about house arrest and releases in the GPS system used to monitor people that have been convicted of crimes, which leads to a lot of questions of who are going to be entitled to these bracelets, Mr. Speaker. Is it going to be people convicted of violent crimes or people convicted of non-violent crimes? Who are going to be involved in wearing this GPS system? I know that the CBRM Regional Police Force is wanting to start this program right away and have it implemented as soon as possible, instead of having 10 bracelets to go on with that. Mr. Speaker, after working a little bit in the young offenders facilities years ago and taking young people out on outings in a secure, spending a couple of years in a secure custody facility, and taking some of the young offenders on outings, whether it was, I remember taking a multiple personality disorder and some juvenile psychopaths and other young people that were involved in many various aspects of the law from an early age, ice fishing. And I remember this incident one day of chasing one down University Avenue in Charlottetown for, I forget, for a half hour or 45 minutes in conjunction with the Charlottetown police and trying to get this young person back in. But this GPS system that we're talking about, I think it'd be good for, I guess, in the safety of probation officers. When somebody is put on a house arrest or whatever else, it's up to the probation officers to arrive there, whether it's 10:30 on a Friday night or 1 o'clock on a Saturday night, to check and make sure that that person is abided by the conditions that are set out in the court. Mr. Speaker, so I think we'll wait and see when some of the police chiefs and other people, correctional facility workers, arrive at law amendments to give some good input and maybe some amendments to this bill to say that, this is, are we going in the right direction? I think we are going in the right direction. I mean, people, they use GPS, are finding cars all over the world. So surely if somebody has a GPS system, we'll be able to monitor where they're at all times. But again, I wonder if when the judges sentence these people and they're sentenced to house arrest in your community, how afraid the neighborhood is to let them know that maybe a pedophile or somebody with a violent history in the past, or, that the probations determine that, after doing a predisposition report, that this fellow is not violent and he'll be okay running the streets. And we have families that are, that live in the neighborhood and, and those types of things. And as the member alluded to in his bill about shutting down crack houses and that, and neighborhoods with drugs and alcohol. So hopefully with the GPS system, these people that have been convicted of crimes will be accountable to where they are and abide by the conditions set down by the courts, I hope that, the 10 GPS bracelets will be expanded sometime down the road, or how this project is going to work, and maybe some of the police forces around the province will be consulted on the use of this. But again, my colleague from Eastern Shore, no, not Eastern Shore, I'm sorry, my colleague from Eastern Passage, it put it quite eloquently that violent offenders are not the ones that these bracelets are meant for. These GPS bracelets are meant for people that that the judge deems that are, maybe first-time offenders or maybe second-time offenders that may not be repeat offenders. And we'll have to look and see at who gets the bracelets and how well they're used. I mean, how they're inputted into the computer, I guess, and how they can be monitored. And when those people that are wearing these GPS bracelets break the law, they'll be returned back to do the remainder of their sentence in custody. So that alone is a deterrent when somebody's under house arrest. But I mean, again, for the safety of the probation officers and the frontline workers that have to visit these people on weekends and take their time and visit them at all different hours, I think they have schedules. And I guess I wonder with the GPS bracelet, I mean, will people still be doing urine tests? Will they still be doing those types of programs within the correctional services and the probation office, But again, I just hope that the judicial system doesn't allow offenders that have created violent offenses or created or pedophiles or people like that are the ones that are getting the GPS system. I hope the people that are getting these systems are the ones that we can be rehabilitated, and the ones that can are the one and take advantage of this system. It's technology that's changed over the years. It's great technology. You can. I remember looking at a 60 Minutes program on Sunday one evening and seeing them track a car that was stolen in the United States and ended up in the United Emirates States, and so they're pretty well pinpoint accuracy with the GPS system. That's not what we're here to debate today. We're here to debate what should we have these implemented right away? Are these good things? But again, I hope it doesn't give the wrong sense of security to the judicial system that these people, once they have these GPS bracelets on, that they'll be okay to be roaming around your neighborhood, or they'll be okay to be in your neighborhood, So I'm just worried about that aspect. I'm worried about the community. It seems to be that there's a growing of crime and violent crime here in certain areas of the province within the CBRM and the HRM, and we do have a great police force in the CBRM and great leaders that are running the police force there. And I hope that along with their efforts into deterrence of crime, along with the efforts of this bill with the 10 bracelets, that we will see some kind of action in the near future. And I thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. I'll recognize the Honourable Minister of Energy to close debate on Bill number 247.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On behalf of the Minister of Justice, I close debate on second reading of Bill 247, the Correctional Services Act.
Hear, hear. Motion is for second reading on Bill number 247. Is the House ready for the question? All those in favour of the motion signify by saying aye. Aye. Contrary minded, nay. Motion is carried.
Bill 247, an act respecting the provision of correctional services.
Order this bill be referred to the Committee on Law Amendments. Recognize the Deputy Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Public bills for second reading. I call Bill number 250, the Motor Vehicle Act.
250, the Motor Vehicle Act. I'll recognize the Honourable Minister of Energy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On behalf of the Minister of Transportation and Public Works, I move second reading of Bill 250, the Motor Vehicles Act.
Hear, hear.
Thank you. I'll recognize the Honourable Member for Cole Harbour Eastern Passage.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm glad to have an opportunity to speak on this piece of legislation as well. Mr. Speaker, this is another example of the Minister of Justice trying to put, patchwork on a system by trying to look like he's being tough. As I said before, I'll say it again. Every time he wants to say he's being tough on crime, we're going to get up in this house and point out you can drive a truck through his ideas with regard to being tough on crime.
And fill it with gas.
And fill it up with gas, that's right, and drive away. Because, Mr. Speaker, yeah, that's right. And depending on the size of the vehicle, it could actually be an expensive process. Mr. Speaker, this is legislation that is meant to, and I'm actually amazed at the comments I've received on this legislation since it was introduced last week. And not one of them has been positive. And there's several reasons why, Mr. Speaker. This is legislation that basically says that if you pay for gasoline and drive off and can be convicted of theft. Now, it's not theft of gasoline. There's no separate criminal code provision. I think it's section 334 of the criminal code. In the bill, that's what it says. That's not a separate provision for theft of gasoline. That's just theft under or over $5,000. Now, I'm assuming in this case it's under $5,000 unless you've got a pretty big vehicle that you're filling up. But the fact is, so if you're convicted of theft under $5,000 for stealing gasoline from Esso or Petro-Canada or whichever gas station, then you're going to lose your license for a period of time. That's the theory behind this legislation. But you know what? There's not a person who has been fooled by this minister's idea of what he thinks is being tough on crime. Now, I'm going to talk a bit about that, and then I want to get into why he specifically picks this crime that people are going to lose their license for, but not others. And why, at this day and age in which we have problems with energy costs, and many would argue that we're being gouged by the energy companies, why he picks this time to try and pass a piece of legislation that punishes people for stealing gasoline in a way that doesn't punish them for other things, like car theft or other things, Mr. Speaker. But I want to start by talking about the fact that this legislation is probably unenforceable for a number of reasons. First of all, you have to try and get a conviction. You know, in a place, to my mind, in this day and age, it's still quite surprising. I mean, I think a lot of people don't like to think about this, but the fact that we do not pay for our gasoline in advance, that we actually get to fill up our gasoline, go and pay. That's the way gas stations want it. In fact, it could be pointed out that specifically they removed the full service system that we had in this province and across the country. Why? Because they wanted to save money. And by saving money, they keep one person on duty in the store or in the actual booth, and you fill up your own gas, you're supposed to go pay. That's how it works in this province. Well, Mr. Speaker, the problem is that from time to time you forget. Maybe it's happened to some people in this house, I don't know. But the fact is, some people forget, and when they forget, they get in their car and they drive away. Well, you know what? They had no intention of committing a crime. They had no intention of stealing. And from what I understand, most times what the police do is they catch the person and say, you forgot to pay. Oh, I forgot. Well, I better go pay. And they go back and pay. Well, Mr. Speaker, that in itself shows how difficult it is to prove intent. Because if you're going to prove a conviction for theft under $5,000, you have to prove that the act of theft occurred and that they had intention of stealing the gasoline, Mr. Speaker. And yet, what we have in this case, Mr. Speaker, is very difficult to prove that there was intention. There are ways of proving it, of course. Interesting enough, as far as I could see, it would actually be easier to prove if you had a full service gas station, because clearly there's someone pumping your gas for you, they ask for the money, you drive away. Clearly, someone has said to you, you owe me $20 or $50 for the gasoline, and you drive away. A lot easier to prove intent there. But when it's self-serve, it happens. Sometimes you may forget, Mr. Speaker. And as a result, it's going to be very difficult to prove intent. So to start with, in a lot of cases, you're not going to get many prosecutions with regard to this issue. So the minister may want to stand up here and say, we're going to remove the license of anyone who steals gasoline. He's going to have a heck of a time getting people convicted of theft under $5,000 for gasoline. That's the first thing, Mr. Speaker. Second of all, in many cases, I only know anecdotally, I'm not talking statistically, but anecdotally, Mr. Speaker, a lot of people who are probably stealing the gasoline are either driving stolen vehicles. If they are willing to steal gasoline, I would lay dollars to donuts. They probably also don't have insurance. They may not even have a license, Mr. Speaker. These are situations where the people clearly have no respect for the law. Why should they respect the need for a license, need for insurance, or even driving their own vehicle, Mr. Speaker? That being the case, why do we think that if they're willing to steal gasoline, that removing their license is going to stop them from continuing to drive? Probably won't. And so, again, even if you can catch them, even if you can convict them for having intent to steal, in most cases it's not going to make a hill of beans to these people who are probably going to continue to do this. So that's another reason why this is not an enforceable piece of legislation, Mr. Speaker. You know, Mr. Speaker, there's a lot of things that can be said about this legislation, and a lot of things that have been said by the public. But I think particularly what concerned people is that this legislation is dealing with creating an extrajudicial penalty for those who steal. And I guess one other thing that I want to bring up, Mr. Speaker, before I move on from the point about enforcement, I'm not clear how the government is going to know when someone has been convicted of stealing gasoline and therefore trigger their suspension of their license. I'm not sure how that happens. Because as far as I can tell, this is an amendment to the Motor Vehicle Act that's only 2 or 3 lines. And it just says where someone is convicted of theft under $5,000 under the Criminal Code of Canada, they shall, with regard to gasoline, stealing gasoline, they shall lose their license. I think it's for 6 months. But, Mr. Speaker, I'm not sure how the bureaucracy within the justice system or the Registry of Motor Vehicles is going to know that someone has been convicted of stealing gas. In most cases, an information that would be laid by a police officer charging someone with theft under $5,000 may not specifically mention gasoline, at least not in the actual information. It may just mention theft occurring at an Esso gas station or a Petrocan gas station. Well, that could be a chocolate bar. There could be shoplifting a chocolate bar, and that's theft under $5,000. They could have stolen tires from the gas station. Mr. Speaker, we don't know that. The fact is that, you know, there's no, I'm not sure how this government thinks there's going to be a bureaucracy that's going to trigger. Is the Crown Attorney? Is the police officer supposed to file a separate form? Are we creating more paperwork for justice officials, police officers, and Crown Attorneys who are already busy? And when are they supposed to file those forms? After conviction? Is the judge supposed to issue an order somehow? It doesn't say that in the Act, that the judge is supposed to somehow issue an order that immediately has the paperwork sent to the Registry of Motor Vehicle. This seems like a haphazard piece of legislation created at the last minute by this government as a means of trying to show that they're trying to be tough with regard to criminals, Mr. Speaker. Yet they didn't think this one through. I'm not sure who suggested this to them. I have a pretty good idea it was the petroleum industry. But why the petroleum industry should be picked to be able to have this special provision put in place when we don't have it with regard to auto dealerships where cars were stolen. You know, I've got Autoport in my riding, Mr. Speaker. It used to be when I was a kid. Doesn't happen as much now. Beautiful vehicles come from Europe. But you know what? They have a lot of security measures in place at Autoport. They have a lot of security measures there. They used to have dogs running around with fences. They still have the fences. They have cameras. They have security officers. Why do they do that? Because they're protecting their product. Because they're saying, if we don't protect these Mercedes and BMWs and Volvos and other vehicles that we have in our area, in my constituency, Mr. Speaker, then they're going to be stolen. Yet instead of the petroleum industry putting in place the provisions to ensure that their product is not stolen, we have the government trying to intervene to make itself look tough by saying we're going to suspend licenses. Well, Mr. Speaker, we don't think that that's appropriate. We don't think that that's right necessarily, Mr. Speaker. Why do we single out this type of crime when we don't single out other crimes related to vehicles? Why don't we single out, as I said, car theft? Why don't we single out, you know, other things that are related to motor vehicle joyriding, potentially as well, Mr. Speaker? There are other things that could be, as well, criminal acts that could result in the loss of a license. Yet this government decides to pick this one at this time. And that's the other point, Mr. Speaker. Why at this time when people are paying so much for energy? I don't know how many people have told me since others have, this is the opinion of others, Mr. Speaker, that, you know, the real robber barons and all this aren't the, you know, clearly someone's stealing gasoline, they're committing a crime. But when you look at the way the price of gasoline has jumped up and how it fluctuated quickly, when in fact we all know there was probably some price gouging going on, Mr. Speaker, as a result of that. You know, it makes you wonder why, you know, if the old story, you can steal $1 million and no one will pay any attention. You can steal $10 and everyone tries to convict you of a crime. Well, Mr. Speaker, that's the kind of dilemma we have here. We have this minister trying to deal with nickel and dime crimes. Yes, they're crimes. Yes, they're bad. Yes, they need to be convicted. But why these extrajudicial provisions when there are other things going on that this minister isn't willing to create extrajudicial penalties for, Mr. Speaker? And these are the type of issues that we have with this legislation. I want to go on. I know my other colleagues will talk more about this as well. But, Mr. Speaker, I want to go on to talk about the fact that. What was that? Well, that's it. That's what I'm going to talk about. Mr. Speaker, so other members of my caucus are going to talk about this, but there's an issue here as well. And that is that there is quite common, I understand, within the gas service industry that if an employee is on duty when someone steals the gasoline, that they are forced to actually have to pay for it out of their salary. Now, the Labor Standards Tribunal and the Labor Standards Division of the Department of Environment and Labor says, well, we've dealt with that because you cannot deduct for anyone under minimum wage. But you know what? In this time in Halifax, particularly, where we have a 5% unemployment rate, I suspect there's a lot of gas station attendants who are making more than minimum wage. Maybe it's only $1 more, maybe it's only 50 cents more, but their policy basically only works for people on minimum wage. Doesn't have any effect if you're actually making $1 more or 25 cents more, because what will happen is the person who owns a gas station can deduct that amount until you pay back the cost. And for $50 at $1 an hour, that would be 50 hours of work in which you're losing an hour of pay. And that seems to be allowed under our Labor Standards Code. And I don't understand why, when you're not the person at fault. This is about reversing the onus. If this government wants to pass this piece of legislation, I want to be clear that from our perspective, right now, a gas station attendant, the onus is on them if the employer tries to claw back the money for gasoline stolen while they were the attendant. The onus is on the attendant to actually prove that they fall within the parameters of this policy of the Labor Standards Division. We think that should be reversed. The assumption should be, Mr. Speaker, that those attendants cannot have a deduction from their income because gas was stolen while they were the attendant. Unless, with the one exception, for some reason, because of their own gross negligence or their own activity related to the theft, there's some reason why they were directly involved. And as a result, they then can have a deduction. But the onus would be on the employer to prove the exception to a general rule that attendants should not have to pay. This is wrong. You want to talk about people who are victimized by this? Clearly, it's not the gas station attendants because they're taking it out of the hide of their workers. They're making the workers pay back in wages what they already lost. And someone speculated the other day, how do we know they're not also claiming this as a loss on their taxes? They could be claiming a loss on their taxes for the theft of gasoline. Who knows? Maybe they have insurance. And yet they're also taking it out of their employer's salary, employee's salary as well. Mr. Speaker, this is a bill that clearly was not thought through by this government. This Minister of Justice, again, so he could get up in this House last Wednesday, and make a speech about how he was a leader. I remember the words, we are leading with regard to crime prevention and community safety. He had to pick something up that showed that he was doing something beyond the same rehashing of the same old announcements that he's made over the last 2 years, Mr. Speaker. And as a result, we have this bill that was hastily put into this House, and one that I would suspect was not well thought out, is not good for Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker. It's not good because it's not enforceable. The people who might be convicted are not going to pay attention to this law. They're going to disrespect it. That the people who actually are victimized are the service station attendants who end up having themselves have to have their salary deducted even though they had nothing to do with the theft, Mr. Speaker. These are all reasons why this bill has serious flaws. And this government, Mr. Speaker, has to be prepared to explain at some point. You know, the Minister of Energy gets up and says, I'll move second reading. And that's been a tendency in this House this session, is that we've had very few bills in which we've actually had some sort of explanation at second reading. And unfortunately, with regard to the principle of the bill, Mr. Speaker, I would suggest to you that it would be helpful if we had the minister stand up and actually explain why we're doing this. And I know it was probably only a coincidence. I hope that it was the Minister of Energy who introduced this, because I would have hoped that we would try and distance ourselves from the one minister who works closely with the petroleum industry, and would have allowed this to be the Justice Minister who was speaking on this bill, because clearly this is a bill that has serious flaws, Mr. Speaker, serious flaws, ones that this government needs to think about when they are considering whether or not this is the type of law we need in Nova Scotia. If you're going to pass a law, make sure it's enforceable. If you're going to pass a law, make sure you're going to take it seriously. It's going to be taken seriously by the public, Mr. Speaker. Don't pass laws to make political statements. Don't pass laws to try and ensure that you're going to look like you're tough on crime, when in fact, this is just another example of this government trying to hastily slap something together without actually thinking through why this is not good for Nova Scotia. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I'll recognize the honourable member for Richmond.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's a pleasure to rise as Justice Critic for our Liberal caucus to say a few words on Bill number 250, and certainly want to commend my colleague from Cole Harbour Eastern Passage for his comments, which reflect in many ways the same belief that we have in regards to this piece of legislation, except I have a bit of a different take on it than what my colleague from Cole Harbour Eastern Passage has, and maybe he hasn't looked at it from this perspective. But there is no doubt, Mr. Speaker, as I was speaking earlier on the previous legislation, the Correctional Service Act, the ankle bracelets, and trying to give Nova Scotians the impression that this government is getting tough on crime. And I used a legal term at the time that it was puffery. And I think here is another example of a bill which would fall under the term of puffery. It's giving the impression that you are somehow doing something, that you've got some sort of superior solution here, which at the end of the day really is doing nothing. Now, Mr. Speaker, when we look at this bill, my colleague from Cole Harbour Eastern Passage pretty much continued to say that this was the government and the Minister of Justice's attempt to give the appearance of being tough on crime. And I agree with him. It is just the attempt of being the appearance of getting tough on crime. But let me give you another spin on what this bill is meant to do. This bill is meant to try and somehow convince Nova Scotians that this government has done something to control the rising costs of gasoline and energy prices here in this province. Because we all know that the Minister of Justice, I'm sure, is trying to assist the Minister for Municipal Relations, who has done an absolutely abysmal job of trying to address the cost of high gasoline prices in this province. Mr. Speaker, I was in this House and watched the Minister of Municipal Affairs tell us, if we passed his beloved Bill 90, I believe is what it was called, that they had the solution to give Nova Scotians immediate relief. They had the solutions that no service stations would close after their bill if the opposition would only pass it. He had all the answers. They were all in the bill. But lo and behold, the bill got passed. And Nova Scotians now know today that the government was only, once again, the Minister of Service Nova Scotia was involved in puffery himself and trying to convince Nova Scotians that they really had the answer, but the opposition was holding it up. Well, the veil was lifted once the opposition actually allowed the bill to go through, and Nova Scotians today have yet to see any concrete solutions from this government. And I would submit to you, Mr. Speaker, that they are going to wait a long time before they would see anything from this current administration. So, how do we try to make the Minister of Service Nova Scotia and the government look a little better? We know the Minister of Service Nova Scotia has been a complete failure. It's the worst file they could have ever given him. Or certainly the worst file they could have given to that particular minister. So what do? Well, now the Minister of Justice is saying, I'm going to try to deflect the reality of what a horrible job you've done by trying to tell Nova Scotians and gas retailers, I've got the solution for you now. We're going to deal with the high price of gas because we're going to make people who take gas without paying for it lose their license. Well, Mr. Speaker, I'm not going to get through all of the legal difficulties that this bill poses and even trying to enforce it. I think my colleague from Cole Harbour Eastern Passage has certainly spoken about that at length, and it doesn't require to be repeated. But it's clear, Mr. Speaker, that to enforce this bill is going to be next to impossible. And second of all, it does nothing to deal with the issues of crime in our province or to deal with the high costs of gas. What this bill causes me to ask, Mr. Speaker, is that if we feel that it's so important that people who are taking gas without paying for it should lose their license, we know that that has been increased because of the high cost of gas. What I would like to know is what is the Minister of Energy, the Minister of Justice, or the failing Minister of Municipal Affairs going to do for Nova Scotia homeowners this winter that will see their home heating oil stolen from their tanks this winter because people who are desperate are going to turn to that to try to heat their own homes or to try to resell it. Because I can tell you, Mr. Speaker, that's the reality of what takes place in Nova Scotia right now. Many Nova Scotia homeowners have seen, whether it's their summer home, whether it's their home when they've been away for extended periods, to return and to see that the oil is gone from their oil tank. So what do we do for that? You know, Mayor from Colchester North has called the police. What are the police going to do? You know?
Order.
Yes.
Order.
No. Mr. Speaker, it's clear that there are issues that to be dealt with here, and the issues are, for the most part, the high cost of energy in this province and how Nova Scotians are becoming desperate because of it. And yet this government, after the failings of the Minister of Municipal Relations, the failing of the Premier, who shook hands, Mr. Speaker, with the representative of the independent gas retailers and said, "You got my word." Well, we know today what that word is worth. I know that the service station owner in Loosedale, Mr. Marchand, he knows what that word is worth. He's no longer selling gas, and he hasn't been selling gas since July. So that word meant a lot for him and his family. And how many other retailers around the province have closed since the Premier gave his famous handshake and said, "You can take my word." That's the reality, Mr. Speaker, and that's the reality of what we face here in this province. And it's nothing but a farce for the government to come in and try to give the impression, one, that they're being tough on crime, two, that they're actually doing something to deal with high gas prices and high prices of energy by saying we're going to take away your license if we catch you taking gas without paying for it. Mr. Speaker, we've heard from the police officers who have said it's next to impossible to get a conviction. It's next to impossible to catch these people because, as my colleague from Cole Eastern Passage said, look, their excuse is that they forgot to pay. Then there's a question of how does a lawyer, a prosecutor, get up and prove that someone who says they forgot to pay and wanted to go back and pay didn't actually, that wasn't their intent? How do you prove that? Mr. Speaker, it is clear. Again, the government is putting this bill forward, hoping that the opposition wasn't going to pay close attention to it, hoping it would be able to say at the end of the session, here's an example of how we've made communities safer, here's an example of how we've helped the retailers around this province, the gasoline retailers, here's an example of how we're dealing with the high costs of gas in this province, here's an example of how the Minister of Relations has actually done something on this issue. The reality is, lift the veil, and when you look behind, there's nothing. This is political opportunism. I would say it's political desperation on the part of the government. The whole issue of high gas prices prevented this government from going to the polls. The Premier has resigned. What is next for this government? It is not getting any better. That is the reality. You know, the Premier has resigned. I don't know why that would surprise any of the government members. Maybe they weren't aware of that, but it's my understanding that he has indicated that he will be stepping down in the very near future. So back home we call that a resignation. I'm not sure what the Tories call it. Maybe they call it abandoning the ship before the ship actually starts to sink. I know there's many people in Richmond County that would say that that's one of the appropriate terms, especially as gas prices continue to be at the rate they are and as home heating oil prices continue to be where they are. Mr. Speaker, Nova Scotians expect from their government real solutions to the problems that they face every day. This is not one of those. The government knows it. The minister knows it. The Minister of Municipal Relations is hoping someone will give him something to try to make him look a bit better from the disaster that he has been as having the responsibility for the issue of high gas prices. So I can tell you right now, Mr. Speaker, I look forward to seeing what is going to come out of law amendments as to whether, at the end of the day, Nova Scotians actually believe this is going to make a difference. Because when Nova Scotians go gas their vehicles and pay for their gas, it is still almost $1 a litre, and they're still wondering how they are going to pay to heat their homes this winter. This bill is not going to make a difference for Nova Scotians. They expected better. More importantly, and more disappointingly, they were told to expect better from the Premier, from the Minister of Municipal Relations, and from this government. And as a totality, Mr. Speaker, this bill is a failure, and their failure to deal with Nova Scotia gas prices and home heating oil prices, I would submit to you, Nova Scotians may have, in the very near future, an opportunity to give their say as to what they think the government as a whole has done on this issue. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Recognize the honourable member for Cape Breton Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to say a few words on this bill. You know, Mr. Speaker, this bill reminds me, you know, the old adage in newsrooms. When they look at a story and make this big banner headline, if it says, if it bleeds, it leads. And that's, you know, this is, and all it was creating a story. And that's what this bill is creating a situation that really doesn't exist, but trying to fool the public into thinking that this government is hard on crime, that they're tough, Now, my colleague from Cole Harbour yesterday introduced Bill 263, an act to make communities and neighborhoods safer, which really gets to the crux of crime. This bill here, I heard when the previous speaker for Richmond was up, he was being heckled from the government side by saying, call the police. So while this government ignores places like crack houses and all that, they want to put a police officer 4 or 5 hours working on a file where there may be $40 in gas. $40 in gas, Madam Speaker, excuse me. So, you know, this is what they would rather have you to do. They would rather ignore that bill.
Excuse me, would you allow an interruption? I'm sorry. The honourable member for Chester North.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And Madam Speaker, the honourable member just said, what do you do when a theft commits? And he's making light about calling the police. Point of order. Madam Speaker, when I was a police officer for 30 years, that's what I expected the public to do when a theft took place, is call the police. That's what they're there for. They're to investigate.
I don't think
and if you people don't want to call the police, if you don't want to solve crime...
That's not a point of order. Thank you very much. We'll return to the honourable member for Cape Breton Central.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. You know, it's you know, thank goodness, you know, that the Dudley Do-Rights of the world, understand.
Order, please. Could we have some quiet in the House? Thank you.
Dudley Do-Right.
Order, please. Yeah. The honourable member, again, please, from Cape Breton Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Madam Speaker, excuse me. Madam Speaker, this is you know, again, that member just doesn't get it. When we talk about serious crime, and it's all about the level of where do you, very, very finite ability of police officers, and we see those resources being stripped away every day, but they would rather ignore a great bill like 263 and move forward on their 250. Now, you know, Madam Speaker, also in this House last year, I introduced a bill that referred to dine and dash and gas and dash. And you know, Mr. Speaker, Madam Speaker, that bill is out there in the hinterland, and I finally, after introducing it last year and writing a letter to the Minister of Environment and Labour for his support, sent me a letter back earlier this week stating, you know what, we used to get some complaints about this, but they stopped, so the problem doesn't exist. The problem doesn't exist because workers have stopped complaining. That's the department's position on this. People stopped complaining. Well, you know, Madam Speaker, that's just not good enough. When it comes to protecting workers, it seems that this government, well, no one's complaining. Who cares? No harm, no foul. That's their position on it. But if big oil complains, let's just kind of push them to the front of the line. Let's not worry about let's not talk about neighborhoods, Mr. Speaker. You know, Madam Speaker, let's not talk about neighborhoods that are facing crisis. Let's not do that. Let's not do something substantive. Let's use our resources to track down people that may take $40 worth of gas. And let me explain further about that too, Madam Speaker, because what we're going to end up here with is workers, and most of these are young workers, maybe working night shifts at these places, finding themselves being even more danger. More danger because these criminals, these people that are doing a criminal act by stealing this petroleum, they'll steal this petroleum and then they realize that the consequences are so great, so therefore the propensity for them to get violent with those workers is greater. What is this government doing to protect those workers? Is this government saying, you know what, to protect you, we're going to make these places have at least 2 workers on a shift to make sure that everyone's looked after. No, the government's silent on that. It doesn't want to talk anything at all about worker safety. It just wants to run the headline of "We're tough on crime," while the crack houses go basically unabated and not worried by this government for its inability to react to Bill 263. But you know what? Don't you dare take a liter of gasoline. What about more directly the seniors who may lose a tank of oil because of somebody's misdeeds in stealing home heating fuel from their tank? Are they, in Bill 250, are they giving those seniors that coverage? No. No, because it doesn't have the glitz. It doesn't bleed, so to speak, Madam Speaker. They want the big thing. They want the big shot of the big tarpaulin out in front of the big service station, and they want this to say, look what we're doing. We're really tough on crime. And I want to know, what part of these, mob groups got together, and this is becoming such a great thing out there in our society, that we have gangs roaming the street, stealing gas from the poor unwitting Imperial Oil and Petro-Canada and Shell. I wonder where they are. But where are they at, Madam Speaker? When they're in New Waterford or Reserve or Dominion or Sydney Mines or Florence and Ashby and Glyce Bay, when they're stealing home heating fuel from our senior citizens that worked all their lives, they're nowhere to be found. They're not tough on those criminals. Madam Speaker, this bill has so much hogwash in it that it's unpalatable. It's got truckloads. It's got probably, you could fill an oil tank with it. There's so much hogwash in this. So why does this government bring this bill forward? Why are they so worried about those desperados of the petroleum industry? You know why? Because it makes them appear to be tough on crime. Appear. We would just wish that this government would go to the polls so they would disappear, Mr. Speaker, Madam Speaker.
Excuse me. I wonder if you'd allow a point of order, is it? A point of order?
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I just wanted to ask the member opposite, from the conclusion I've drawn from his debate, as long as someone or somebody else has more than you, then to steal from them is perfectly correct. That's what the lesson I'm getting.
Thank you. I don't believe that is a point of order, and we'll return to the honourable member for Cape Breton Centre. Thank you.
In my history in this House, in this chamber with that member, he always comes to the wrong conclusion. But Madam Speaker, it's not about that. It's not about if you have, it's right to take from them. The reality, I'll answer the question. I'll do more than his time as a minister. I'll answer his question where he very seldom answers ours. But I will answer that. It's not. It's about degree, though. It's about fairness. It's about saying, I'm tough on crime. I will help one group, but I will not help another group. Why in this bill don't they put in there that you will lose your license if you steal home heating fuel from a senior? Why isn't that in there? That's why the conclusion is where we come with this, Madam Speaker. It's not a matter of it's all right. Theft is wrong. Theft at any level is wrong. But this party just doesn't get it across the way. They think that, it's more important to look tough on crime. So, Madam Speaker, what I would say that this minister has clearly misread the public of Nova Scotia on this bill. They know what this minister's about. They know about his smokescreen. They know that this will not survive the litmus test of this House. It will not follow the litmus test of the Law Amendments Committee. It will not follow the litmus test of Committee of the Whole House on Bills.
Excuse me. I wonder if we could stop for a point of order, please, from the honourable member from Colchester North.
Colchester, Musquodoboit Valley. Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, I've listened to this NDP drivel here for quite some time, and it has incited me to get up on a point of order And I'm not going to speak about the fact that in the beautiful province of Saskatchewan that it has the highest crime rate in Canada and has an NDP government. I'm not going to speak about that, but what I am going to tell you, Madam Speaker, is that honourable members opposite should take a look at the legislation. Then they should go out and speak to some of the gas jockeys or the gas attendants that are working so hard at the service stations across this province that are being hit.
Order, please. Order, please. Order. Order. What? Excuse me. Out of order, right? Yeah, excuse me. Thank you very much. That's not a point of order. Thank you very much. We'll return to the honourable member from Cape Breton Centre, please.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Well, Mr. Speaker, you know what? There's less blow from Hurricane Wilma than that over there, Mr. Speaker. You know, that member could stand up and debate the issue, but he'd rather just be his usual blowhard self. So, Mr.
No, I'm sorry. Order, please. Yeah. Order, please. Thank you very much. Yeah.
There's a lot of hot air coming from that side. Madam Speaker, there's lots of hot air coming from that side. And for just what he brought up was exactly, if he was listening, basically answered our argument, was however he referred to those workers, and when we wanted protection for those workers, his government would not support that. His government will not bring that bill forward. But yet he says, he tries to shove it off some other way. So, you know, Mr. Speaker, Madam Speaker, if he really wanted to, he would get up and in earnest debate this bill, but he gets up and, you know, much like when he was in opposition previous and would talk about fishing license and be tough, but when he got over there, he cowered and he didn't do it. Yeah. So, you know, Madam Speaker, this is just more of the rant from that side. That really, this is about not listening to Nova Scotians. I talk to people that pump gas in my community, Madam Speaker, and I speak to people in my community every day about this, and they know that this guy is just blowing it out his ear, Mr. Speaker, this minister, when he talks about being tough on crime. Because we still see it every day. You know, where was this minister this weekend trying to get to the bottom in my community when there was a jailbreak? He was nowhere to be found, supporting the residents of Gardiner Mines, trying to make their community safe, madam. That's what this is about. So, you know, Madam Speaker, this is not about being tough on crime. This is about an ineffectual government that's in its dying days, that's on its last legs, and groping in the dark.
Order, please. I will entertain a point of order. Thank you. I hope so.
Madam Speaker, you know, the NDP rhetoric is starting to be ridiculous. Did the member from Cape Breton Centre claim that the Minister of Justice should have been outside the jail on guard when the prisoners broke out? Now that is absolutely ridiculous. Madam Speaker, you can't let him ramble on with so much irrelevancy. It's a disgrace to this House that he's being so irrelevant in here today. And it's a disgrace to that party. It's a shame.
Thank you. Order, please. Order, please. Thank you. The honourable member for Cape Breton Centre and on the subject of the bill. Thank you.
Thank you. 250, Madam Speaker, 250 does not address crime in this province. It doesn't address jailbreaks. It doesn't address anything, Madam Speaker. This is a bad bill, which Nova Scotians will prove is a bad bill when it ultimately fails, and we will see that over at law amendments. So with that said, Madam Speaker, I'll take my place.
Thank you very much. I would like to recognize the honourable member for Victoria the Lakes.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, I hope that the general public that are viewing this on TV today will take into account the fact that the previous speaker is auditioning for Club 54 after the next election. Mr. Speaker, this is a serious offense, and it requires some serious debate. The theft of gasoline leaves these hard-working station owners, it's like neighbors stealing from neighbors, Madam Speaker, because when somebody drives off with a tank full of gas or partially filled or whatever, it is not the large oil companies that they're stealing from their neighbor. In a way, I can understand the reason why they would want to bring a bill forward, but the problem that I have with it, Madam Speaker, is the fact that it's a quick fix for a timely problem, and I don't think too much thought has gone into the end result. Madam Speaker, somebody drives up, fills up their tank, drives off. It's been said, call the police. Well, what else do you do? But when you call the police, what information do you give them? The license number of the vehicle, if you were fortunate enough to have that. If you're busy as a one-station attendant doing several things, then how can you make sure you get the license number of every vehicle? If you were successful in getting the license number of the vehicle, and then the police discover the vehicle, it's parked in a parking lot downtown somewhere with no driver inside. Prove who was driving the vehicle. Do you look at the registration and say, okay, the ownership was to Mr. So-and-so, so therefore he loses his license? When he says, no, I loaned my car to somebody, and I don't know if they gave it to somebody else or not, but I loaned it out for the afternoon for somebody to run a few errands. So, Mr. Speaker, it's very hard to enforce when I think about how, when you call a police officer and give them the information, just how can they expect that officer to really do his job and be effective? A possible solution that I've experienced myself at some service stations when traveling through the U.S. quite a number of years ago, Madam Speaker, was the fact that when you pulled into a service station in the U.S., being from Nova Scotia, you automatically go to the pump and haul out the nozzle and go to fill up your vehicle, but nothing happens. It took a while to realize that you had to go into the service station and pay for the amount of gas that you wanted, and then with that amount paid, you went out. The attendant that was inside in the garage, the attendant then turned on the switch to the pump and gave you the $20 or $30 or $40 worth that you decided to put in your tank. If you were filling up your vehicle and didn't know what the amount was going to be, you tendered your credit card, and then you had to go back in to retrieve it and sign for it, or they had your credit card. So there was a guarantee there that nobody would gas up and drive off. Mr. Speaker, we're talking about drivers driving up to the service stations and stealing gas from the gas station operator. Nobody has mentioned the fact that the large oil companies, with their outrageous prices and their terrific spike in prices overnight, 30 to 35 cents a litre in one shot, what about the stealing that they were doing from the motoring public? And it seems that no condescending attitudes or finger pointing was turned on to the large oil companies. Mr. Speaker, talking about another aspect of the bill, there is, Madam Speaker, already on the books penalties for stealing. How about using a vehicle in the commission of an offense? Mr. Speaker, I know that is something that is also liable where the vehicle can be seized. And that is quite a much more harsh, and possibly either there could be financial assistance by the oil companies to install cameras that would register the license plate numbers of the vehicles, and that way they're guaranteeing that regardless of who the driver was, that is the vehicle that filled up, that is the vehicle that drove off, and that is the vehicle that will be seized. Therefore, using myself as an example, I am not going to loan my vehicle to anybody unless they are a reliable person, Madam Speaker, because I do not want to lose my vehicle, or neither would anyone else. So there's those aspects to look at, and it's okay for me to stand here and criticize, and that's my job. But what I try to do, Madam Speaker, if I can, is offer a solution. It may not be the proper one, but hopefully it will get the government thinking that maybe that this bill could be modified, or let's approach the large oil companies and say, listen, you have this is an investment in your own business. A lot of the oil companies own the service stations. I think it wouldn't cost them too much. It would be an income tax deduction, I'm sure, against their massive profits if they were to buy cameras and install them at the service stations, and that would relieve a lot of the fear and the pressure off the gas station attendant, sometimes only a student after school pumping gas, and maybe the first or second day on the job, somebody drives off with a tank of gas. The kid feels terrible. The owner is probably up and lets that young person go. They lose their job because of it, maybe because they didn't get the license number, they were inattentive, or whatever excuse can be used. So it would provide protection for the oil companies, for the gas station operators, for the attendants, and for the general public, and maybe curb this theft of gas while it is a timely subject and a timely problem. So, Madam Speaker, it's a serious situation, and as I said already, it boils down to doing nothing but stealing from your neighbor, and that's unacceptable. The bill in its like I said, I think it was, as I said, it's a timely problem. It's getting lots of media attention, but a quick fix for political means, no, that doesn't sit well with me, and I have to criticize on that point, but I would wish that the government would look into the suggestions that I've made and maybe make representation to the oil companies, and hopefully between the province and the companies involved and the station operators, Madam Speaker, that they would come up with a solution to this problem. And with that, Madam Speaker, I thank you for the time and the attention of the House, and I'll take my seat. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
The honourable member for Sackville-Cobequid.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I too want to stand and have a few words about Bill 250, Madam Speaker. When we first learned that this piece of legislation was coming forward, we thought, okay, well, let's see what attempt the government's going to have on fighting crime in this province. And we waited with anticipation to look at this and review this piece of legislation to see if this is something that the province needs, and those people involved with the theft of gasoline, would support this piece of legislation, Madam Speaker. But we were quite discouraged when we did finally see this bill introduced, Madam Speaker, because it does indicate, I think, and we think as a caucus, a lack of commitment from this government to address crime in this province, Madam Speaker. Addressing crime is an important issue, and we've all heard from constituents of ours throughout this province about we have to toughen the penalties when it comes to crime being committed in this province, Madam Speaker. But I don't think I had one call about ensuring that the oil companies in this province, are protected from gasoline theft, Madam Speaker. I would hope that we would see changes that would come about when it comes to crime, dealing with maybe protection of those workers who work in the gas stations throughout this province, Madam Speaker. Those people tend to be some of the lower paid individuals in this province. I know that there's some policies or regulations under the labour standards that say these employees, if they're making a minimum wage, would not have to pay back any shortfalls when it comes to people leaving without paying for gas, Madam Speaker. But I know for a fact that not all of them, there are some in the province that are getting paid minimum wage to provide that service to customers in the communities throughout the province. But there are some that are making a little more than that. Not a lot, Madam Speaker. They don't make a heck of a lot of money, pumping gas, but you can't even call them have that designation anymore, because we know in the province that every day that goes by, there's less and less service stations that have full-serve gasoline pumps, Madam Speaker. They don't pump gas anymore. You know, I was fortunate when I was going to high school. I was able to get a job at a gas station. I pumped gas. That was my job, Madam Speaker. I did make minimum wage at that time, but that has changed over the years, Madam Speaker. For one, it has reduced the number of jobs in our small communities that maybe some of our students depended on because of the elimination of full service in our province, Madam Speaker. It's been a slow process. It's taken many years now, but it's very hard for those individuals that depend on full-serve gas stations to find those throughout the province. Those seniors who might not be able to get out of their vehicle to fill their car up. Those people with disabilities. Why aren't we seeing pieces of legislation that would protect them? That would protect those gas station attendants, Madam Speaker, to not incur the cost of having to repay their employer because a vehicle come in, filled their car up, and drove away, Madam Speaker.